in this video, I'm going to be breaking down an autonomous AI system that facilitates communication between three different parties. This particular AI system is designed for property management companies, but it's still a good example for any industry on how you would use AI in order to facilitate communication, real world applications for things like voice agents, and basically how you would set up the logic for this type of system. In order to make sure I explain everything well enough, I'll be basically breaking this thing into 4 different parts. So first, I'll go over a diagram, which is basically a high-level overview of how the whole system works together in the different parts. Next, I'll go through the Vapi setup, the particular prompt I use for the inbound caller to receive calls and then the outbound caller to make calls. Then I'll go into make.com, and then I'll also show the Airtable database that make.com is interfacing with, and basically explain how make.com is tying everything together. So let's go ahead and get into it. Inside of Lucidchart, I have a couple of diagrams that illustrate the different parts of how this system works. We start with a tenant calling, and this flow is basically handled by Vapi. Vapi is the AI voice software that we're using to implement handling the phone lines for this particular scenario. So when a company calls, the first thing that will happen is a Vapi voice agent will answer the phone and begin talking with them. And depending on what type of information the tenant's looking for, depends on what's the next action that particular agent will take. So if they're just asking about information, then the agent will just go ahead and search its knowledge base and then answer their question right then and there. Very simple. But if they're asking about something else, then it's most likely maintenance, because this is for a property management company. So if for some reason they're not calling about a question in the knowledge base and they're not calling about maintenance, then this is an edge case. So this call could be transferred to a human, or the voice agent could simply say, "We'll get back to you later. We'll follow up. Somebody in our staff will follow up to you later," and have a real human analyze that conversation and what they're actually asking for. But most times, if their tenant isn't requesting information, they will be calling about maintenance. And that's when we move on to this next part of the flow, having that voice agent request information from the tenant. So the tenant is going to gather things, or the voice agent is going to gather things from the tenant, such as the details from the property, details around what's not working, the power isn't working, or the sink is clogged. It'll get some more information on that. It's prompted to ask questions like a service professional, so that we get as much information as possible for the quote, or just for the landlord to decide whether it's even worth having a professional fix, or if they want to have something other measures taken before they actually call a professional. So after the Vapi voice agent has gathered this information, then it's creating a support ticket. And this support ticket is created inside of Airtable. So what's going to happen after the conversation is over, the transcript is going to be sent off to make.com to be analyzed. And after it's analyzed and the information is parsed using AI inside of Make, there will be a branch to go ahead and create a support ticket. And then lastly, the customer will be contacted using the Twilio integration on Make. They'll receive a SMS update, basically with their ticket number on it. And I'll be walking through all of the Make automations in a second, but I do want to go through the actual structure of this system before I get into the actual animations or automations. So this is the flow for when a support ticket is created. Now, when a support ticket is created, an important piece of information is when I was setting up the system, I went ahead and made a database for service options. So inside this database, there are a bunch of local companies near a property. There's HVAC companies, plumbing companies, electrical, general handyman, etc. And basically, they're all inside of an Airtable allows you to arrange information inside of bases. So they're all inside the whole AI system. All the data is inside of a base, and all the data on service options is on a particular table inside of that base. So when a support ticket comes in, we're searching the table with all of the service options in order to figure out which one. And we basically have an automation in Make that performs a query. It uses AI to determine what type of service is necessary, and then it's going to query that table inside of Airtable based on the results. That after we query the service table looking for the particular service needed in order to fix the problem, we're going to be given a list of businesses. And after we have this list, also inside of Make, we're going to either take two actions following. So depending on the current time, if it's 9 to 5 and the service provider will answer, then we're going to go ahead and call the service provider right there. This is also a more automated system. So typically some landlords might not want to call the service providers immediately. They might want to look at the situation beforehand. But in this case, we're not going to be requesting service right then and there. We're just getting a service fee that it'll cost for them to come out, as well as their availability. And that was another thing that we gathered from the tenant in the first flow, was their availability over the next 7 days. So basically, if it's not 9 to 5, if for some reason the tenant called at like 9 p.m. at night, then we'll just go ahead and create a new record in another table inside the same database that we call service options. I think it's called service consultations. I'll show you guys the actual Airtable database in a second, but we're creating a record in a different table that's showing all the potential options for that particular support ticket. But if it is within business hours, then we're going to go ahead and call these different service providers in order to see if they're available for when the tenant said they were going to be available, and also to get the number on how much it's going to cost to have them come out to the property. And this is just a service fee before they even assess the situation and start working. But after we get this information from them, if they hang up, then it basically takes this same approach where we create a service option record, but we just update like the status to call not answered. But if they do answer, then we still create the service option record, and then we update values on the table with the availability of the service provider as well as their fee from coming out. Now, this is the final step, and this is basically before we get to the final step, let me just explain how this works. If it's not current business hours, or if for some reason they don't answer, we basically have our service options base where we have the different providers, and probably populated some information about their phone number even if we didn't call. And if we did call, then we have a record that's basically tracking how many times we called and how many missed calls we have. Every day, I believe I said it till 10 o'clock, Make.com is going to pull all the records from this service option records. And for the ones that haven't been contacted, they're going to have a certain status. It's going to filter based on that status, and then it's going to call them again. And it's basically going through the same flow that they would have went on over here. It's using a Vapi agent is prompted to ask them about their availability and compare it to the availability of the tenant, and it's also prompted to get the fee that will cost to get them to come out. Basically, that automation is going to run, and then there's also follow-up automations for people who we called once and missed, or we called twice and missed. And after we call 3 times, that's basically when they'll get to this category where we say service options finalized, because after 3 missed calls during business hours, depending on your situation, you might want to keep following up. But for this particular case, that wasn't necessary. So after a service option will be finalized when either they missed 3 calls or they answered and provided the service availability and the fee. So once all the options are finalized, then we can go ahead and send these availabilities to the landlord. And it's basically, we're just taking this data from the service options table inside of Airtable, and then we're going to transform that, have ChatGPT basically transform that data into an email that we're going to send to the landlord. And the landlord is going to reply back. We're going to use AI to parse their reply in order to determine which service provider they want to go with. And then we'll have another Vapi agent call that service provider. They'll also pick the time. It'll probably be the availability time that matches, that already was confirmed to be a match between the service provider and the tenant. So they'll choose that time and the provider. The database, the make.com, will get that email, parse it, and then run another flow, which basically triggers another Vapi voice agent to call the provider and schedule the service, and then call or text the tenant in order to confirm that service has been scheduled and remind them of when it is so that they can be at that property at that time, and then go ahead and update the record. Now, this particular flow will vary. In this particular situation, the landlord didn't need to have the Vapi assistant call and schedule it, because typically for a landlord to schedule service, they need a credit card anyway. So in this particular case, the landlord would just call the service provider themselves after everything else had already been finalized and just give them the credit card number and go ahead and make it official. But depending on how automated a landlord wanted the system to be, they might want to just give the voice agent the credit card and have a specific voice agent to go ahead and schedule service. It just depends on your use case and what you're trying to do. But this is basically the final flow in this whole AI system. Okay, so right now we're inside of Vapi, and I'm going to be explaining the inbound and outbound prompts. So for both of these scenarios, I just named the assistant Jane. So we have a Jane inbound and then a Jane outbound. But basically for the inbound prompt, I basically just have, hi, you've reached this property management company. How can I help? The role is very simple. Just, you're a helpful property manager with extensive knowledge in the quote process for any type of issue. So this is basically just ensuring that when a tenant says they have a problem, it's asking the proper follow-up questions in order to either get a quote or in order to let the landlord know like exactly what's happening and give them enough information to potentially diagnose it on their own. Now, inside of this particular prompt, it's a pretty simple step-by-step process to follow. Basically ask them about their issues, confirm the address, ask for extra information, make sure you get the availability, let them know about a maintenance ticket being created, ask the caller if they need anything else, and then go ahead and end the call. So basically what any property manager would have to do if somebody called about a property. Notes: it's important to let the AI know to keep the responses short, because it will ramble, have a bunch of run-on sentences and sound unnatural. When you just prompt it to keep the responses short, to use pauses and avoid run-on sentences, and just keep things brief but not like in a rude way. And then you have to ask it to ask questions one at a time, or it'll just ask them like 4 questions at once, which nobody's going to respond to all of them properly. So just remind it to ask the questions one at a time, wait for the caller to respond, and then move on to the next one. We used some emotional prompting over here. Just, it's vital to the success of the company, it's vital to my career. This is proven, like they've run studies on it, it's proven to get better results. And this is the outbound. So this is calling the service providers in order to get their availability and get a fee. The first message we have this hello. This is just because like as soon as somebody picks up, it launches into this first message. It might, if it immediately launches into, they might not be fully listening yet. So I just put this hello in with the pause for the first message in order to make sure like they answer, they say hello back, and they're listening, and then get into it. For this particular task, I have it announced that it's an AI caller, just to let people know, because some people might not realize it's AI, or some people might realize it's AI and think it's a spam call. So that's why I just go ahead and have it like label the situation like I'm an AI caller calling on behalf of someone, so that they know that it's a serious call. It's for a property management company, but the caller is AI, and it's basically going to use the information. The way we call it and the way we make the API call basically allows us to put in variables. So like the service provider, what particular service provider we're calling. Are we calling an electrician, a plumber? We can put that in, and then we can also put in the description, which came from what the tenant reported when they initially called to make the support ticket. The first thing we're going to have this caller ask the service provider about is if they're available when the tenant's available. If they're not, we're still going to capture their other availabilities, because this is going to be necessary for further communication with the tenant. Pretty much the same type of notes to make sure it's not asking 5 questions in one sentence or having long run-on prompts. But this is a very simple prompt. It's a very simple use case. All it's doing is making calls, asking about availability, and then asking about price. And that's pretty much all it has to do. So now let's go ahead and get into the scenarios on Make. This is the first automation. This is basically whenever a voice agent finishes a conversation, it sends all the data through a webhook to make.com. Inside of make.com, we're going to parse this webhook. The only thing we really want is the transcript. We're going to feed this transcript into ChatGPT and basically decide whether it's a maintenance request or not using ChatGPT. So if it's not a maintenance request, then we just go ahead and stop right here. That's what this filter is for. But if it is a maintenance request, then we're going to go ahead and run through this flow. For this particular module, I basically told ChatGPT to return the description of the problem, I think a title for the Airtable record, and then the availability of the tenant in order for the maintenance provider to come by. So it's supposed to return a JSON object. If you don't know what that is, it's basically a data structure that is inside of curly brackets where you have keys and objects, and the keys are basically just a title for the particular information that you want. So in this particular case, I have a description as a key. I think I have availability as a key, and then like a title as a key for the actual record title. But if it is, sometimes ChatGPT doesn't follow instructions properly and it doesn't return a JSON. In that particular case, we have a fallback where we're just getting the title and the description out manually and then creating the Airtable record. And then we go ahead and send an update to the tenant about their new support ticket. If it does work properly and creates a JSON, then we just use this parse JSON method, and then we put that same information into Airtable, create a support ticket, and then send a text letting the tenant know that a support ticket has been created. This is the Airtable database. So over here we have a bunch of information on the actual support tickets, a title, a description, a status. We have the call transcripts for when the tenant reported the problem. We have created times. We have tenant availability, and then we have service consultations. Our service provider database consists of these companies, and this is basically just our different options that we've went ahead and put in beforehand. For our consultations, whenever a support ticket comes in, it basically searches the search providers based on their particular industry, and then based on that industry, it pulls basically all the options and either calls them or it's waiting to call them depending on the time of day. The last table in this particular Airtable base is the tenants. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'm the only tenant. But that's basically how the data is set up inside of Airtable. Moving on to the rest of the system, this is the second layer of the system. Whenever an Airtable record is created, we've set up an automation inside of Airtable that calls a webhook. And that webhook is basically going to have the information of the new record that was just created. We're going to search Airtable and get that particular record from the actual Airtable module. And then depending on the time of day, we're either going to create a new record inside of our service consultations table inside of Airtable. We're going to update the record as waiting to be called, and we're going to put the potential businesses for each record. So if it's outside of business hours, we're going to create a new record inside of service consultations, and we're just going to change the status to waiting to be called. But if it is inside of service hours, then we're going to go ahead and make that request. And this request is a call to the Vapi API, which is basically going to trigger a call. What is this parse JSON doing? Okay, so it's basically the parse JSON is in order to get that particular call ID and go ahead and create a record. Now, we don't just go ahead and get the data back from the call on this record because we don't know how long the call might take. It could time out. It should only be like a 2-minute conversation, but it could time out. So it's simpler to have that particular Vapi call to just wait on that call to finish and wait for that particular webhook, and then set up a scenario based around that webhook. But we also we're getting certain information in order to call it. So we're just going to create a record with the call ID and then match that call ID to the record so that we can go ahead and update that information. So let's go ahead and move on to the next scenario. So this is the scenario that will be called once that call that we made to the service provider to ask about their availability and the fee for coming out. Once that call returns, this is how we process it. We're immediately going to look for the record that we created based on the call ID, and then we're going to find that record. And depending on how the call went, if the service provider didn't pick up, then we're going to go down this route. And depending on if it was their first time not picking up, their second time not picking up, or the third time not picking up, we're going to assign different values to that particular record inside of Airtable. They did pick up, we're going to analyze the transcript. And basically, we want to get out certain information like the service fee and their particular availability, and whether that availability matched up with the availability that the tenant gave us, if the tenant gave us an availability. The easiest way is just to have ChatGPT parse it and return all of that information in a JSON structure. But in the off chance that ChatGPT messes up and doesn't return a JSON, instead of causing an error by trying to parse a JSON that isn't in JSON format, we just go ahead and check that in the router. I basically just check it for curly brackets, and if there aren't any curly brackets, then we just get that information manually with different ChatGPT calls that just return. Each of these is returning something that we're looking for, like their availability. Does the availability match up with the tenant? What's their service fee, etc.? And we just get all the information we need that way. And then we go ahead and update the Airtable record based on whether they were available or not. In this particular case, I believe this if their availability did match up, and this one is if they didn't. Now, if ChatGPT works properly and it does return a JSON, then it's a pretty simple process just to parse that JSON, get all the information we need out, and then once again we're updating the Airtable based on whether their availability matched or not. These three scenarios are pretty similar. It's basically just calling people back. This is basically a timed request that's running at certain times of the day, getting all the records that are waiting to be called, calling them, and basically going through the same steps that we saw in some of the other modules, where we just parse this for the call ID, update that particular record, and then wait for the call to return so that we can add that data to our database. Basically, the last step of this particular flow is informing the landlord. So this is when basically all of the records have returned, as either we called them 3 times and they didn't answer, or we called and we got their availability. So we're basically getting the information that we need out of this Airtable, and then we're iterating through it and basically aggregating all the information from these 3 records into a JSON that we're going to feed into ChatGPT. So that's what this is. This set variable is getting the particular fields we want out of this Airtable and then aggregating that into a JSON, because that's just easier to feed into ChatGPT. And then when you have iterator, you have to basically, this is going to basically loop. If you're familiar with programming, if you're not, it's just going to run for every record that we got in this search. It's going to run through this whole these 5 modules. It's going to run through that however many times, the same amount of times as there are records. And then at the end, we combine all these records into a single JSON and we feed that into ChatGPT. And then ChatGPT takes all that information and basically turns it into regular words. It takes a JSON and just turns it into regular language and asks the landlord what they want to do. Now, depending on how in depth you wanted to make this particular flow, you would probably add another module parsing the response from that landlord and connecting that to a scenario that makes more API calls to the particular service provider they chose, with more information about the date they want to schedule. But for this scenario, due to the fact that service providers often need a credit card on file from the landlord would just go ahead and call these service providers up manually and go ahead and schedule everything. So if you're interested in having a system of your own implemented for your business, then book a call with us to see if we can get that done for you. And if you're interested in seeing more videos in this AI automation voice agent space, then subscribe to the channel for similar content.